Good morning, everybody. This is the meeting of the Committee on Rules, Regulations, Private Bills and Privileges on Friday, January 22nd. Welcome to committee members, Sid McEwen, Minister Matt McKay, Hal Perry and Lynn Lund. We have a few items to go through on our agenda today prior to the upcoming sitting. So can I have a motion to adopt the agenda as presented? So moved, Lynn Lund. Thank you. So the current work plan, we're kind of tying up some loose ends and things that we have discussed previously. Plus, we also have Motion 96, which was referring a number of matters and was voted on in the House to bring to this committee. So we need to have a look at that. And then any new business. And then after that one, time permitting, we're going to move into in-camera to consider our report, but we want to make sure we have enough time to discuss the items in the motion because there are a number of items in there. So it may be that we may need to have another meeting following this one if we don't have enough time. We'll just see how we get on today, if that's okay with committee. So you have a copy of Motion 96 attached to your agenda. And I'll just go through the key points on this one for the record and to remind everybody what we're looking at. So this was starting with, whereas Rule 60 of the Legislative Assembly requires a minister to whom a written question is directed to file an answer without any unnecessary delay. And whereas presently and historically responses to written questions have not been delivered in a timely fashion, and whereas the rules and orders of the House of Commons provide a specific time period in which written questions should be answered and allow for the referral of the matter of the failure of the government to respond to a written question to an appropriate standing committee once that time period has elapsed. And whereas Rule 110.9 of the Legislative Assembly does not establish a clear and consistent timeline for executive responses to committee reports. And whereas annual reports of departments, agencies and Crown corporations are tabled in the Legislative Assembly but are not ordinarily referred to and considered by its committees, and whereas federally annual reports of departments, agencies and Crown corporations are automatically referred to standing committees for their consideration, therefore be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly refer these matters to the Standing Committee on Rules, Regulations, Private Bills and Privileges for its consideration, and that the committee recommend to the House any changes to the rules of the Legislative Assembly of Prince Edward Island necessary to address these matters. So there's a number of items in there. One of them is around written questions, around the time required or expected to respond to written questions, and then what happens if the response isn't timely. Also around the responses to committee reports, also around the reports of departments, agencies and Crown Corps. So it's three different issues. And as usual, as with any other committees, the clerk and I met in advance of this committee to sort of go through to make sure that we had information that we could provide to the committee on what's happening in other jurisdictions on these matters so that we can provide some context to committee members for their decision making. So maybe if I can ask our esteemed clerk to share some of those key findings. Perhaps do we want to start with the one around written questions? Would that be the will of the committee? May we start with that one?
Sure. So I just looked in to see what other jurisdictions are doing in terms of responses to written questions, and then time limits. So some jurisdictions don't have time limits, don't have limits on questions. So it's kind of the same rules that we currently have. Other jurisdictions that have time limits on responses to written questions include Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Nunavut and Northwest Territories, and also the House of Commons. So out of these jurisdictions, 3 have a limit on the number of written questions that may be asked. And then Alberta has a provision that written questions may be accepted or rejected. And then also the House of Commons does have a limit on the number of questions that can be asked, written questions that can be asked. So that's a little bit of a jurisdictional scan. There are other jurisdictions similar to us currently that there's no time limit on responses and no limit on questions that can be asked.
Thank you. One of the other considerations is that there's a history to written questions that predate some of the members of this committee, but there has been some challenge in the past with the number of questions being asked, which is also a consideration. And that when we look at rules, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the rules that will be in play no matter who is sitting in the seats in the House, that the rules have to work not just for any current circumstance, but to reflect something that will work now and into the future. And then the other consideration, there are many in this, for committee members, is that not all questions are urgent. Some questions are can I have this information? So maybe that's something else that we should also be thinking about. That's something that I've thought of that I would like to add to the conversation. Perhaps I can open it up, though, for any comment. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I was just hoping I could ask for a point of clarity, Emily. I appreciate the jurisdictional span. I find it really helpful. Can you give the committee a sense of what the question limit is in other jurisdictions? Is it consistent from place to place?
It's not consistent, but it is in the range of, I think House of Commons is 4 at a time, and then another jurisdiction I think was upwards of 10, but it was kind of in that limit between 4 and 10, in that range there.
Okay. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So that's really helpful. And the turnaround time on getting responses back?
There would also be a range as well. So some had 45 days, some had, I think, even as little as maybe 21 days. And I think there was others that had a bigger range. I'd have to go back and look, but there was kind of that range. 45 seemed to be pretty standard. And I believe that was the House of Commons was 45.
Keeping in mind that other jurisdictions don't sit in the same structures. Like, for instance, House of Commons doesn't sit, like they have break periods more consistently, or change periods. So that's part of the consideration is the capacity of the time to respond. Go Lynn, and then to Minister. Yeah, Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. This will be my last question on this topic. I'm just trying to get a sense of how this works in other places. And would it be 4 questions per member or 4 questions to a department from?
So in the House of Commons, it is 4 questions per member. And I think in any other jurisdictions that have limits on questions, it's per member. So yes, I guess theoretically, all of the questions could go to one particular department. There's no limit on which department they go to.
Okay, that's great. Minister McKay?
Thank you, Chair. And just on that note as well, so when it's 4 questions per member, how often?
From my understanding of what I've been reading, it sounds like once you get the response, then, if you had 4 questions out, if you get a response on 1, then you're down to 3, you could ask a 4th. That was my understanding of how most other jurisdictions had that rule. So once the question is received, then you're kind of back, you have that question to ask.
Any other comments, Sid?
Thanks, Chair. I'm really happy that this motion came forward, that we're dealing with it. In 2016, I had written the Rules Committee as well on the very same topic, and I won't read word for word the letter back then, but basically I had suggested a 45-day period that the departments or ministers respond to the written question, and unless there was would require government to provide answers to written questions within a 45-day period, and if a response cannot be delivered within that time frame, a reasonable explanation of the delay and an updated time frame will be given to the MLA that asked the question. There was significant, I'll say, media attention after a couple of those meetings, and it was on limiting questions. At the time, I was adamant that I didn't think we should limit questions. I understand why the federal government does it. We have 300 and some odd MPs at any given moment. Someone decides to, flood a number of questions. We have seen a lot of written questions from opposition in the past, from different political parties in opposition as well. But I'll go with consensus of the committee. But I like the idea of having a time limit on it.
Thank you, Sid. Minister McKay?
Thank you, Chair. So that was one of my concerns. The time limit doesn't so much bother me as a minister of a department, but how many questions come in. We would have to probably hire more resources or allocate somebody to do that. If we had 100 written questions come in a month, we're taking somebody out of a role to do it, right? So as the questions are in the House, whether it's budget or questions from the floor that we tend to take back, or myself the day after, a lot of that comes from your directors and CEOs watching. So if there's any amount of questions, I'm guessing departments would have to look at additional resources to be able to respond back to that. But that's just something to take into consideration as well. We don't have dedicated staff that could handle a significant amount of questions at one time without taking them from another role.
Sure. And I appreciate that input from your experience as minister. I think we need to be clear that we're talking about the written questions that are submitted on the floor, like from either on the floor or via the process directly from an MLA, separate from those that might occur during like estimates or budget review. But I recognise that they have the same impact in terms of workload.
Right.
Certainly, one of the concerns that we would need to think about is that this could be abused by people asking too many questions. So there's that the risk then though is by putting limits on it, you're limiting the opportunity to do your job as an MLA. And so it is, again, a tough balance. If we look at the ask in the motion, it is about the time to respond. So it really is a question. There's two parts to it. One of them is, what I'm hearing is the Rules Committee, thinking about time, that's a fair thing to ask, that there's a timely response and put a time limit on it. And then the second part is, do we also need to limit the number of questions, or do we need to go with allowing people to use that wisely? Or, I guess I'm asking the committee, how do you feel about there being two separate things there and whether we should be looking at that? Minister MacKay.
So I guess if you're talking 45 days in some jurisdictions for 4 questions, well, there's really no reason that 4 questions should take 45 days to respond back to. But if 200 questions come in, that's a different story, right? So I'm not convinced we couldn't lower our time frame down, but if a department was to get 500 questions in a course of a 60-day period, that's a whole other topic, right? So I don't know how you get to that point, but for the most part, the time frame, if you're dealing with 4, 6, 8 questions, I think your time frame changes on that as well, depending on how many questions come in.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I was thinking through that too, and if the limit were 4 questions per MLA at any given time, assuming everybody wrote 4 questions to the same minister, including the speaker and all of cabinet, it would be 108 questions. But we can probably assume the speaker's not going to be writing questions. We can probably assume that cabinet's not going to be writing questions. So even if every single member wrote to the same minister, you're probably looking at less than 70 questions. And I think it's highly unlikely that they would all go to the same minister. So I can see some benefits to having a limit, but I think we can talk about where that limit is based on probabilities.
Another, following from that, another way to look at it is, rather than limiting it to questions per MLA, it would be the number of any current questions per department. That the maximum that a department can have open at any given time, which then doesn't restrict a particular MLA. If there's one MLA who's the only person that's asking questions, then it doesn't limit them. The limit is on what the department can cope with rather than what the individual is able to do, and that could help with the feeling that people are being limited in their right to ask. It puts the pressure back on, it puts the recognition on where the block is, or the limit is with the department. That's another way to look at it. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what you're saying. I think the only challenge there is if I've decided that I'm going to ask all my questions to Matt, I make sure I forever have 4 in, which means that Sydney can't ask questions to Matt. And if I get a response back and then immediately submit my next one, I could certainly hog my fair share of attention. So that would have to be considered too.
The alternative would be that 50 questions, the department is able to handle up to 50 questions within a 45-day period.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter who they come from. But again, the other piece of this is the administration of it, the tracking of it, who keeps count, right? And that's the concern for the clerk.
Certainly. And I guess whatever the committee decides, if they'd like to make some suggestions on these rule changes, that we would figure out a way to manage that on our end. So I guess just for everybody's information now, the way that we handle written questions now is that they do come in and they're processed. We put them in a specific form, and then those are sent out by Legislative Assembly staff to the department. So they're sent to deputy ministers, communication officers, and administrative assistants in the departments. So we try to kind of get a wide, kind of everybody in the minister's department that can get those emails, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And then when they return those answers, they return them to a table officer, we sign them in, and then we distribute them to all members and we post them on our website. So that's our process now. So it would just, I guess if there's any changes that are made, we would just kind of have to tweak how we track the questions that come through and how the answers come through as well.
All right. Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. I am recognizing the irony in opposition MLAs talking about limits and perhaps a government backbencher suggesting that we don't touch limits on questions. I have concerns over saying a department, we should only have so many questions into a department at one time. In future, if I wanted to be cagey and submit questions to say Matt the whole time, to keep his department full of 50, would never allow, Lynn to submit questions to Matt when she's the official
Yep.
critic as well. I would suggest, and I could put a motion forward, that we deal with just the time limit right now, and if we have to come back with limits on questions, we do so at another time. I just don't like the taste of limits on the number of questions. I think, and I respect what Matt said too, and I respect what the ministers before said when they respond to me, but talking about limits and rules. But I think if we're doing it responsibly and respectfully, that we could keep on going forward. The other thing, if we see an influx of like hundreds of written questions, I think that's also cause for saying maybe that's information that the department should be just putting out publicly anyway. I know some of the questions that we put forward in opposition and some of the questions that the Liberal opposition years and years ago put forward. Some of it's just basic information that open data should be having out publicly anyway from government. So I would suggest that if you see those type of questions come in, maybe that stuff should be public anyway, and it kind of gives a reminder to government to do that. But I still like the idea of just putting a time. I like the idea of giving a minister a chance to be able to say, do you know what, there's a reason that I can't get that back to you in 45 days or whatever the limit is. And I, as an MLA asking that question, I would respect, that to say, if I submitted a written question to Matt and he's like, do you know what, that's going to take some time, or that there's a change in the department that won't allow me to answer that in a certain amount of time, I'm okay with that. But it's just my opinion, but I would stay away from limits right now, per MLA or per department.
Okay, thank you, Sid. Did you want, I know Matt has something to say, and then I'll come back to you to see if you want to make a motion. Matt?
I can't speak on behalf of a government department because on the written question side of it, but have we ever reached out to departments to see how many questions they can handle? Because with the process, Emily had just said, when it goes to the deputy, the admin staff, how many questions, and looking back when we were in opposition, and now that I'm on the other side, being a minister of a department, to see 200 or 300 questions come into a department and for the administrative staff to try and answer those questions, working with the deputy and the comms person in a short period of time, maybe it's doable, I don't know, but have we reached out to see on a department level how many they can handle? Maybe they can handle 1,000, I don't know.
I think the short answer from my side is no, we haven't. To be honest, Minister, I don't think that we, as in terms of the rules and the role of MLAs, that government would be able to say that they can put a limit on that. I really don't know what the precedent would be from there. I mean, written questions are part of the function of the legislature and part of the function of how we communicate. So no, I mean, I don't know if that would even be in scope for us to do that, to be honest. But
Okay.
I'm interested in what the committee needs to think about that. Minister?
No, and I just want to use one other example. This is because it's been an eye-opener for me with Minister of a department, is, for example, FOIP. So when somebody FOIPs in the process it goes through, so it's nothing to get a FOIP that is 1,000 pages. Like, it takes time, right?
Yeah.
And you're taking resources. There's not somebody allocated strictly for that. So you're taking resources to work through that. So I'm not saying we don't have a limit. Maybe we go exactly what Sid's saying and work through it, and if it looks like we're getting bombarded down, I guess we can always take it back and look at it, but I just don't want to see it get abused because we're taking people out of roles right now for that,
Yep.
is all, right?
I mean, just before I come to you, so just point out that, you know, the original request in the motion was that there would be a specific time period in which they should be answered and then allow for the referral of the matter if government failed to respond. But, you know, what Sid had suggested was that there's a time limit, and then if your department isn't able to respond in that time, that you reply back and say, look, we can't do this because here's the extra time that we need. And that may be an alternative which we could have a motion on rather than what's been suggested, because this is a recommendation. It's not a requirement. So it's saying what, you know, was in the original motion. If we have a motion that says instead let's do it this way, that may bridge that space that you're concerned about, Minister, that gives you the opportunity in your department to say, you know, we can't do this and this is why, but this is what we can do instead. But to Sid's point, the initial piece is around timely response. So, you know, did you want to follow up on that, Sid?
Yeah, and a couple of points. And so you made my point, like if Matt's department is flooded with too many questions, that's a reasonable response to me as a, you know, if I've asked 180 questions to Matt's department and I get a letter back, as, you know, I'm not saying we do that, but I'll probably put a motion forward to that effect. But then if he says, do you know what, you asked 180 questions, I can't get them all back, I'll get, you know, we'll try. So to me, that's a reasonable reason why the minister can't respond.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's, like, I think that would be, I'll put a motion for it. I think that would be covered if we say that, you know, a reasonable reason why would be just too many questions at once, or, you know, we're getting through them. The other thing too, though, is, you know, I do want to point out too, I think it's the job of the department staff to answer these questions too. And I understand what the minister talks about, you know, it takes time away, but I would argue that that's part of the role of the civil servant as well, is to provide those answers to the minister to bring back to the legislature as well. So I think that actually is part of your department staff to respond to that on your behalf as well. I wouldn't, you know, say that, that it's taking away from something else. I would argue that's part of their job responsibility.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing, committee, is that there's, and Hal, I'm looking at you thinking, I don't know if you wanted to add anything at this point, but that a time limit is something that the committee is potentially okay with, but that rather than saying that we don't want to be too prescriptive in the rules, we want to leave space, because, you know, there needs to be some assumption that people are going to have some level of common sense, we hope. And so a prescriptive time, but not a prescriptive number of questions. So we're not, but instead, perhaps Sid is looking at a motion that says, here's the time limit. If the department isn't able to meet that time limit, they must respond in writing and give a different time. Something like that. Yeah. Is that a motion you wanted to make, Sid?
Yeah, Chair. I'll move that the rules of legislature would require government to provide answers to written questions within a 45-day period, and if a response cannot be delivered within that time frame, a reasonable explanation of the delay and an updated time frame will be given to that MLA.
And that's from your letter from 2016.
It would be.
It would be. How convenient. Here's one I prepared earlier. Yeah. Does the committee, did you get that? Committee, can I ask for approval of the motion as presented?
Approved.
So moved, unanimous. Thank you for that. Okay. So at this point, I'll also just be really clear with the committee. The other part of that thing was to refer to standing committee once that time period has elapsed. I'm hearing that that's not something that the committee is feeling they need to put into rules at this time. Instead, we've got this option to have an extension of written response. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. So moving on, there's the same kind of question around the response then for clear and consistent timeline for executive responses to committee reports. And this is, so reports coming in from committee that have recommendations, what is the time frame for when we expect to hear back on the response to those into the record, whether that be on the floor of the House or by written response. But I am open to any comment or discussion from committee members. to be clear, there has not been a precedent for this previously. Committee reports get tabled and they're done. Sid?
I was just going to say that I don't believe it mentions in the rules anything about that now, just that. No,
110.9.
On the timeline.
I was just going to look it up, actually.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, like, does it say it already?
Yeah, it references Rule 110.9. Sorry, I'll find it here, just so
So
I
what are we
apologise.
debating then?
Okay, so what we currently have in the rules book under Rule 110.9 is a written executive response shall be tabled in the House during the next seasonal sitting following the adoption of the committee report.
So that sounds good to me. So what are we changing?
It says the clause that was in the original motion says, and whereas that rule is there, it does not establish a clear and consistent timeline. What we have in the rule is it's during the next seasonal sitting. So if a report was tabled in the winter session that we just had at the end of 2020, then the executive response must be tabled in the next sitting. Sid?
Thank you, Chair. That does sound like it outlines it fairly well. What I would suggest is why doesn't our Rules Committee send a letter to, I don't know, either each individual minister or the clerk of executive council, I don't know, but just send a letter to remind departments or ministers of this rule. It sounds like it's fairly well laid out that they have to respond. So
It does.
I don't think we need to adjust that at all. I like that timeline.
So it would be the will of the committee that the Rules Committee would remind all departments that this rule exists, that they are required to respond, and we can give them a list of reports that are expecting response based on what has previously been tabled. Would that be acceptable to the committee? Great, thank you.
And to confirm, would those letters be addressed to the ministers of the departments?
Yes, because it's executive response, so minister and deputy minister,
Sure.
would that be acceptable? Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, moving on. The next one is about annual reports of departments, agencies and crown corporations that are tabled but are not ordinarily referred to and considered by its committees, and that these should be automatically referred to standing committees for their consideration. The clerk and I kind of had a look at what we're talking about in terms of volume of reports, and it is significant. I would point out that we in PEI in the legislature here have remarkable autonomy in what we do in our committees. Our committees have the luxury of, in some ways, of being really quite independent in terms of choosing their work plan and where their focus is. But at the same time, a lot of these annual reports are relevant to the work of the committee. And so I would really like to hear, again, from committee if they have any thoughts about how to tackle this recommendation, being, again, that it is quite prescriptive. Sydney.
Thank you, Chair. I disagree with having all those reports automatically referred to the standing committees. I think the standing committees, as you said, Chair, have their own autonomy to ask a department in to talk about their annual report, to ask why an annual report hasn't been finished, like all that kind of stuff. The committees that I'm on and looking at other committees that I've subbed in on, the agendas are robust and full. I think any member of the legislature at any time can request a committee look at an annual report. So I know in public accounts we have a summary of all the reports that are outstanding right now. They're significant, so I can't wager a guess of how many different annual reports there are that are listed in this motion, but it's dozens and dozens, I would say. I would suggest that they don't automatically be done, and any member is welcome to bring up any annual report at any time in any committee. So I think we already have that ability. I just don't like the thought of automatically having dozens and dozens and dozens of reports just sent to committee that the committee is forced to do.
Can I ask, Sid, you mentioned at PAC that you are aware of the reports that are outstanding. Is that the case for members who are on other committees? Do you know what reports your committee is actually responsible for? Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. It's interesting you say that because that's what I was also thinking as well. I had a two-part question. The first is if Emily could give a sense of what that number actually is for even not exactly, but approximately how many reports would be covered by this section of the motion? Are we talking 10? Are we talking 50? Do you have a sense of how many?
I don't have a sense, but I guess if it's, sorry, I have the motion here.
So reports from
Departments, agencies,
and crown corporations that are tabled in the legislature.
I would say a considerable amount. I'm sorry, I should have prepared that. I don't have a number for PEI, but I would say dozens of, multiple dozens.
I appreciate that. No, not at all. So I suppose I was heading in the same direction with this that the chair is. I wonder if an update of which reports have been filed can be given to the chair. It can be part of the committee agenda where it is discussed in the same way as review of correspondence is, and we can decide what we want to do with it so that the committee is aware that these reports have come forward or are outstanding, and if they wish to dig into it, they can, but it's, to Sydney's point, not automatically added to their work agenda. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Lynn. I think that was something that the clerk and I had talked about, and you're right, like I know when I'd looked at it before, there were over 100 when I looked sort of at last year and tried to filter out documents that would have been tabled, you know, by leave in the House versus sort of all the various reports. There are many. But I don't know for sure which ones would be relevant for the committees that I sit on as well. So, you know, that again, we'd have to ask the clerk about workload, but if part of it, if it is a matter of sort of saying these are the reports that may be considered by your committee, and then the committee can decide whether they, you know, and the committee members can decide. But to Sid's point, that's part of the work of being on a committee, is being informed about all the pieces. We may not necessarily catch all the ones that kind of come across the desk or end up in the office as they're tabled sometimes, because it's another piece of information that's kind of coming on through the pipeline. I don't know about any other offices, but certainly in our office there are stacks of reports, and they're everywhere, and it can be a bit overwhelming on how many there are. So, clerk?
I would say that certainly, you know, could offer that as a suggestion, but really we view that each committee is kind of the master of its own procedure. So if the committee decided that, yes, we would like to keep a list of reports that come across that are tabled, and they can direct the committee clerk to kind of keep that up to date, that's certainly something that we can do, but that each committee really kind of determines its own work plan and procedure. So it could be a suggestion, but really it should be up to each committee how they would like to proceed on that.
Right. So what I'm hearing from the clerk is it's not a recommendation that the Rules Committee would make or a rule change. It would be a recommendation to committee chairs, perhaps. Sid?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Clerk. About my next question was, can we even do that as rules? Like, do we supersede all the other committees? Like, can we tell, as the Rules Committee, can we make a rule that they even have to, I disagree with it, but can we even do that?
Yes, so I think if the committee, there are other jurisdictions that do refer all their annual reports to various committees. So, for example, in New Brunswick, all of their annual reports are automatically referred to the Public Accounts Committee, and that is a rule that is kind of talking about the mandate. So it would be almost a change of mandate for committees that annual reports are referred. So if that was the case, that would be a rule, that would be a direction to the committee that this is also included in your mandate. If it's just a procedure that committees might want to consider, then really it's up to the committee to decide how they want their procedures to kind of roll out. Does that make sense? So that it could be part of the mandate, and the mandates are in the rules, but if it's just a suggestion that really each committee is the kind of the master of their own procedure, so they could decide how they would want to keep on top of what annual reports maybe are outstanding or which ones have been tabled, but would be for each committee to decide.
I mean, the primary piece to your question, Sid, is around the authority, is that committees shall be individually empowered to examine and inquire into all such matters and things that may be referred to them by the House. And in addition, committees by majority decision of their membership may meet to examine and inquire into such matters and things as the committee deems appropriate. So it would be a change, you know, at that kind of level in terms of sort of authority or mandate, in the same way that PAC has a very specific additional part of its mandate that other committees don't have in regards to the review of the AG report. So with regards to this request, or this aspect of the motion, I'm hearing that certainly from a couple of members that we're not comfortable with requiring or making a rules change that requires a change in the committee's mandate. But we would recommend that that committees consider the relevant annual reports at the discretion of the committee, I guess. Sid?
I don't agree with that either. I don't think we should be recommending what the other committees do. Just my personal thought.
Okay. Does anybody have any other comment on this? No?
We had this debate at Public Accounts too, but recommending what other committees do, and
Yeah.
I spoke out against it then. I'm like, the committees have their own domain, they can do what they want. They don't need to hear from our committee on what their priority should be.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing then is that this aspect of the motion is not considered to be part of any recommendation from the committee at this point. Are we okay with that? Okay. So it's a no on that piece. Thank you for your input. So on that basis, then we have a couple of rules changes that we are bringing forward. One rule change, which is around a time period for response to written questions, with an option for departments to indicate if they have any difficulty reaching that. And then we have a general recommendation, not a rules change, around which includes a follow-up on advising ministers when they need to respond to committee reports. And other than that, this motion then is concluded. Okay, thank you very much for that. Is there any other new business at this time that the committee would like to bring forward for discussion or consideration prior to us going to discuss our final report? No? No new business? You're so quiet. On that basis, then, we'll take just a short recess so we can go in camera. I think we have enough time for us to be able to consider our report and conclude some of the business for the committee prior to the session. Claire?
We need a motion to go on camera.
We need a motion to go in camera. May I have a motion for us to go in camera? Lynn Lund, so moved. Thank you. Okay, we'll just adjourn briefly.